Good afternoon, everybody. So welcome all of you to our Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security called IFANS. Thank you very much for your participation. As you know well, the IFANS Talks is a kind of special lecture program. It's organized by the IFANS to promote our understanding among the public on the foreign policy issues as well as major international current issues. Today's IFANS talks, we are very pleased to invite three distinguished ambassadors in Korea of the United Kingdom and France and European Union. I personally appreciate the three ambassadors for their participation and will provide their views and insights on current international political and economic issues, including most famous current issues, Brexit. And now I'd like to introduce the first speaker, Ambassador Charles Hay of United Kingdom. He'll make a presentation on the topic of UK, EU, and Korea relationship post-EU referendum called Brexit. And second speaker will be French ambassador, Ambassador Fabien Penonen of France, who will make a speech on the topics of 130th anniversary of diplomatic ties between France and Korea. And third and last speaker will be Ambassador Gerhard Sabatil from European Union, who will speak on the European Union economic relations with the Republic of Korea and the EU's approach towards North Korea. You know, among the three ambassadors, I found some commonalities. The first, they arrived Korea in 2015, last year. So this is the second year for three ambassadors in Korea. And second point is they have very strong career and the background in Asia. Their knowledge and understanding on Asia is quite significant, and they serve in European Union, Brussels, three of them, and they made, lastly, great efforts to develop our bilateral ties between Korea and United Kingdom, and Korea and France, and Korea and European Union, and as a whole. So now we'll listen the three speech and present lectures from the ambassadors, and 25 minutes for each ambassador, and then followed by our Q&A session. It'll take about 30 minutes. So without further ado, I'd like to invite the first speaker, Ambassador Charles Hay from United Kingdom. Please.
안녕하십니까. 주한국 영국 대사 찰스 헤이입니다. So that was Korean style, but I was told that I had to do this lecture TED style, and as we were discussing earlier on in the room beforehand, TED Talks are more geared towards Californian entrepreneurs than middle-aged diplomats. But we're all going to do our best, I think, to make this more of a TED Talk than a conventional lecture. So it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here with a pretty full house, people standing at the back. It's a great privilege for me to have the chance to talk to you a little bit about Brexit, as it's called these days. And we have a saying in the UK, and the saying is, a week is a long time in politics. Well, this week has been a very, very long week in our political system, because a week ago, as I'm sure you all know, the British people went to the polls and they voted on a very simple question. Should the UK remain a member of the European Union, or should it leave? And the answer was a pretty resounding one. It was the largest democratic exercise we've had for a very long time. 33 million people voted, a very high turnout, 72%. And the answer was that 52% of those who voted thought the UK should leave the European Union, and 48% of those who voted thought the UK should stay. The Prime Minister, who'd fought hard in the campaign for a yes vote, he has resigned, and we're now waiting for a new Prime Minister to be appointed in a leadership election in the Conservative Party. So some huge implications. And I'm just going to talk for a little bit about what happened in the vote, a little bit about why we did it, and then about the implications for the UK relationship with Korea at the end. So, I'd imagine a lot of you have a big question in your mind. Why did Prime Minister David Cameron call this referendum on such a very big question in the way that he did? Now, I was listening to the radio yesterday, the BBC, and there were two people on a sort of comedy current affairs program, and they asked exactly that question. And one of them said, well, it's all about history. You need to understand the history of the relationship between Britain and Europe. And to understand that, you need to go back to the end of the Second World War. And it was at the end of the Second World War that the first agreements came into place, which subsequently became the European Union. And the second one said, really, do we have to go back that far? And the first one said, well, actually, we've got to go back a bit further. We've got to go back to the First World War and what happened after the First World War. Really? Do we have to go back there? No, you're right. We've got to go back to the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to fully understand the reasons why the UK has the relationship with Europe that it has now. Gosh, that's a long way back. No, now I'm thinking about it, we've got to go back to 1815 and the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars to get some idea of the true nature of the relationship. I'm going to stop there with the history because my point is that you can talk about history all day, but in the end, it came down to a political decision. The history is very, very important, but it's too much to even start going into now. But the fact is that the Prime Minister had put in his election manifesto that if he were elected in last year's general election, then he would hold a simple in-out, yes or no referendum on UK membership of the European Union. He won the election, and therefore he had to fulfill that manifesto promise. Okay, you say, why did he put that promise in his manifesto? And the answer was that he was dealing with a lot of pressures and a lot of forces that were building up in the UK and had built up for quite some considerable time. Now, probably the most obvious of these was the rise of the UK Independence Party. The UK Independence Party basically is a party with one policy, which is what they call independence for the UK, and by that they mean leaving the European Union. Now, this is a party that has been gaining in strength, and in the last election, they got over 3 million votes. Secondly, there's always been a strain of thinking in the Conservative Party that has been very Eurosceptic, and that had to be taken into account. I have to say that also, on the left wing of politics in the UK, there has always been a strain of Euroscepticism as well, all for very different reasons, but it's all there. Anyway, the Prime Minister decided that to deal with all of these issues, he would put that manifesto promise out there to the people. And what he said was that he wanted a strong Britain in a reformed European Union. So after the election, he then went to Brussels and he then tried to negotiate a package of reforms with EU member states, EU partners. And his message was very clear, that if he didn't get the right package of reforms, he would not campaign for the UK to stay in the European Union. In the end, he did get a package of reforms that addressed some of the issues that he raised, and so he campaigned very hard for the UK to remain in the European Union. But the results were, as I said before. Okay, so that's the background. So what actually happened in the referendum? Who voted for what and why? So I've got first of us couple of slides here. So that's how they voted. Yellow means stay in the European Union, and blue means leave the European Union. So what do you have? You have Scotland in its entirety voting to remain in the European Union. You've got a mixed picture in Northern Ireland, but basically a majority in favour of staying in. In the rest of the UK, You have a big chunk of Remainers in London and in the surrounding area, and in one or two other places as well, in Wales and some of the big cities in the north of England. Now, for the next slide. A bit more of a breakdown of that. So as you can see, London was pretty firmly in favour of remaining, with nearly 60%. But other areas of England were rather more in favour of leaving. And that's another breakdown, and you can see in this breakdown there were only two areas which were majority remain, which were Scotland and Northern Ireland. Now, as you can imagine, there has been an unbelievable amount of analysis done so far of who voted, why they voted, and what they thought they were voting for, and what motivated them to vote in the way that they did. And there's one in particular that has caused a lot of comment. There we go. Age would seem to be a very determining factor in your view on the issue. So, according to this chart, if you are young, you are far more likely to vote for remaining in the European Union, but the older you get, you're more likely to want to leave. But I should caution against drawing any immediate conclusions from this kind of graph, because the fact is that amongst young people, turnout was relatively low. So all we can say is, of the young people that came out to vote, a majority of them wanted to remain, but quite a lot of them didn't vote at all. So we don't know what they thought about it. Maybe they didn't care enough about it. Maybe they found it too difficult to register. We really don't know. But already there are social media comments from young people saying, "I'm never giving up my seat on the bus ever again to an old person." So there are other things you can see when we look at who voted the way that they did. Firstly, the wealthier you are, probably the more likely you are to vote Remain. The more highly educated, the more likely you are to vote Remain. The taller you are, the more likely you are to vote Remain. Now, I made that one up. But the point is that you can cut the data any way you like, and we will all spend a lot of time in the future trying to understand it all. But I think one of the key points of all of this is the one about wealth, and London, of course, is one of the wealthiest parts of the UK. And I think there is an issue here over people feeling that they have or have not benefited from the fruits of globalization, and very real concerns over the impact of globalization, the loss of jobs in the manufacturing sector, in factories, in mines, shipyards, and so on. Now, the debate before the referendum and since has very much focused on a number of key issues, and I don't really want to go too far into why people voted the way that they did, but there were certain themes that came up. So there was a theme about the economy. Is it better for our economy to be a member of the European Union? And there I think the argument was fairly comprehensively that yes, it is much better for the economy of the UK to remain in the European Union than to leave. But there were lots of other issues that came up as well, and there's a whole group of issues that I think were brilliantly captured by the Remain Vote slogan, which is "Take back control." Now, what do they mean by that? They meant a number of things. One, there were a number of people that were concerned about the burden of regulations, of laws, and so on, that are made in Brussels and that are then, as they see it, imposed on the British people. So there's that side of it. Secondly, there was a question about the amount of money that the UK pays into the European Union and how much it gets out. And while you can debate the figures, the fact is that we do pay in more than we receive. And then thirdly, there was the very sensitive question of free movement of people, which is part of the fundamental four freedoms of the European Union. And what we have found is that a large number of our fellow European Union citizens, particularly from Central and Eastern Europe, came to the UK to seek a better future for themselves. And that has caused strains, and it's caused a lot of questions to arise about identity. And I think it's these questions about identity that underlay quite a lot of the reasons that the people voted the way that they did, even though they may have recognized that voting that way was actually bad for them economically. So, without any more of the whys and wherefores of the way that people voted, what happens now? Well, in formal terms, we need a new Prime Minister, and that will be a decision of the Conservative Party, and that will happen before October. And that new Prime Minister will need to decide the way forward for Britain. Because the fact is that, as many people are now really realizing, there is one way of being a member of the European Union, but there are many ways of not being a member of the European Union. And let me explain a bit what I mean by that. Being in the EU means basically accepting all of the obligations and rights and so on, although the UK had certain opt-outs, for example, of the euro. But it meant accepting free movement of people and so on and so forth. Now, a country like Norway has a status outside the European Union. They are a full part of the single market, but they're not a member of the European Union, but they do have to pay into the European Union budget, and they have to accept free movement of people. So that is one way of being out of the EU. And there are other ways that's the closest way of being out to the EU, but there are others which take you further and further away, if you like, from the core. So our new Prime Minister will need to decide which of these models of EU non-membership he or she will want to negotiate with our EU partners. There is a process which is called the Article 50 process, which has to be gone through as and when we want to leave. So our Prime Minister will formally notify the European Union that we want to leave. That is the Article 50 trigger. And then we have 2 years to negotiate a departure from the European Union. And that can be extended if everybody agrees to extend it. So that's the process. Now, on a few other things that people are talking about as an implication of the referendum vote, some people are saying, well, what does this mean for Scotland and for Northern Ireland? Scotland, as you saw, voted comprehensively to remain within the European Union, and the leader of the Scottish National Party is already making noises about a referendum on Scottish independence. Now, as some of you may remember, we've already had a Scottish referendum on Scottish independence. We had it in 2014. And the answer then was that Scotland would remain a part of the United Kingdom by 55% to 45%. So that was a fairly comprehensive answer. But the argument now is, well, things have changed a lot. If the UK is going to leave the European Union, taking Scotland with it, surely we should give people the chance to say, we'd rather be an independent Scotland within the European Union. Now, I don't know what's going to happen with that, but it's entirely possible that at some point that question will have to be seriously addressed. For Northern Ireland, the issues are slightly different. It's more that the possibility now rises of once again the UK having a land border with the European Union in Ireland, between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, and all of that brings with it. And remember that in Northern Ireland, until quite recently, we had quite serious troubles, violence and terrorism, and it's only recently we've been able to move forward through a peace process. And the EU membership for both sides was an important factor in that peace process. So some people have worries over that too. There are even people saying, well, maybe this won't happen. Maybe something will happen to stop the Brexit vote, because after all, they haven't triggered Article 50. Maybe they never will. Maybe they'll leave it for so many years that people will kind of just move on and just carry on as they are. Or maybe there'll be some sort of legal challenge which will stop it. I don't know. Quite frankly, there are any number of scenarios that you can imagine. But at the moment, the government is clear that they are going to go forward and follow the will of the British people, which is to take the UK out of the European Union. So, those are all the things that will change. There are quite a lot of things that won't change. The UK is not suddenly going to float off into the Atlantic. We are still going to be there as part of Europe, even if we're not a member of the European Union. We will still have very, very close trading and political relationships, not only with our EU partners, but with all of our other old friends and allies. The UK will continue to be a member of the G7, the group of 7 nations. We will continue to be a member of the G20. We will continue to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. The UK economy is strong. We're the second fastest growing member of the G7. And of course, that's one of the reasons why we ended up attracting so many people who wanted to come and work in the UK. Our unemployment rate is extremely low, about the lowest it's been in our history. So we are also fulfilling our international obligations. The UK is the only major country that is giving both 0.7% of our income for development and meeting the NATO target of 2% of GDP for defence. And that will not change. The basic essentials of British foreign policy will remain exactly the way that they always were. So we will continue to work globally with partners to counter terrorism. We will continue to work to counter climate change. And we will continue to work to tackle all the issues of globalization. None of that will change. With respect to our relationship with Korea, I would say that the most important aspect, and the thing that I've been asked about probably more than anything else, is trade. You know, what is going to happen to the trade and investment relationship between the UK and Korea? And it's a very strong relationship. It's very important to both sides. So at the moment, the basis for our relationship is the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Now, as I've said, the UK hasn't yet formally said to the European Union that we're going to leave. And even when we do, there's at least a 2-year period after that of negotiation. So for the foreseeable future, we remain subject to all the rules, regulations, obligations, and have the same rights that we did before as an EU member state, because we are still an EU member state. So the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement still continues to apply to the UK as it always did. Now, I've already had conversations with a number of senior Korean people, most recently Im Sung-nam, and we're all clear that what we want to avoid is any legal uncertainty, and we want to give continuity to the trade and investment between our countries. Now, I would imagine, I'm assuming, that that will mean that once the UK is no longer able to benefit from the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement, we will have our own bilateral free trade agreement. And I would very much hope that that would be on the same lines as the existing EU-Korea FTA. But all that is for the future, as I say. It's, nothing is going to happen for quite some considerable time. And I mean, just to stress again how important it is for both sides that we get this trading relationship right. In 2015, the UK was the largest EU market for Korean goods. And Korea is a major market for British goods and services too. The statistics are sometimes a little bit hard to understand. I keep having arguments with my colleagues in the embassy about which statistic actually means what. And last year, the Korean Statistical Office said that there was a surplus of trade on the Korean side. But the British Statistical Office said there was a surplus of trade on the British side. So I don't know who's doing better out of the trade agreement between the UK and Korea, but from the fact that we're both disagreeing and we're about the middle somewhere, I think we're probably benefiting both sides very well from the free trade agreement. And trade on both sides has gone up very fast in the last 4 years since the free trade agreement came into effect. So on the Korean side, you sell us a lot of cars, you sell us ships, you sell us semiconductors, you sell us machinery, and so on and so forth. And on the UK side, we sell you cars, we sell you machinery, we sell you chemicals and oil, and of course lots and lots of luxury products like Lush cosmetics, for example. I don't know how many here are a fan of Lush, but that's us. Burberry, of course, Mulberry, and so on and so on and so on. So there's a huge amount of trade that goes on between our two countries, and we both sides want to ensure that that trade continues, whatever happens in the relationship between the UK and the European Union. Now, as I said, the UK will continue to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and as such, we have a very strong interest in all global affairs, and we've been a very strong supporter, a staunch supporter of the Republic of Korea with respect to DPRK, in terms of sanctions and sanctions policy and sanctions monitoring. Now, I cannot see why that will change in any way over the coming years. What will happen after the UK leaves the EU is we will have more scope to agree ourselves our own policy, whereas at the moment we follow an EU common position. But I don't think that will change the fundamental way that we conduct our foreign policy. Culturally, we have a very strong relationship as well. And I should draw your attention to the fact that next year will be a year of UK culture in Korea. My French colleague is going to talk in a minute, I think, about the French year of culture. Next year, it's Britain's turn. And the year after, there'll be a year of Korean culture in the UK. And I can say that in the UK, knowledge and understanding of Korean culture and Korean values is definitely on the increase. More young British people are studying Korean in British universities. Now, I've tried that, and I found it really hard. So I don't know why anybody would choose to study a subject that is so hard. But there are lots of new students who are studying Korean. And again, there's very strong flows of people from Korea who want to study in the UK. And we have formed some very, very powerful alumni groups here of Koreans who studied in different UK universities. And if I can just add an aside here, that in the latest rankings, the UK has 4 of the world's top 10 universities and 18 of the world's top 100. Now, I don't think that Brexit is going to change that either. So I would continue to encourage any of you who want to come and study in the UK to do that. And already we're seeing some concerns over foreign students in the UK, but as I say, nothing is going to happen for several years. So there's no need to be concerned, whatever the future arrangements with the EU are going to be. So, to sum up, over the last week we've been dealing with what's been a political cataclysm, which was not expected, certainly by my Prime Minister or many commentators. But the fact is, in a huge democratic exercise, the British people have said that they want change. They don't want the status quo, and they want to leave the European Union. Now, my job as a civil servant is to implement the government's policy of the day. And at the moment, the government is busy choosing a new Prime Minister and setting the course for whatever that relationship with the EU will be. But in terms of the British relationship with Korea, I don't think there's going to be any change at all for some considerable time. I very much believe that we will work together successfully to implement a new free trade agreement which will permit the trade between our countries to continue. And I believe we'll continue to work together with our shared values to address the issues of globalization. Thank you very much.